we're going to take a step back into the 1800s. And I know nowadays when the 4th of July rolls around, it typically means you're going to go travel somewhere with your family or go see some family members. There's a lot of drinking involved, and then everybody sees the fireworks. Um, However, in the 1800s, from my understanding, the 4th of July was a much bigger holiday than how it is today.
I
And
would say, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry, let you finish.
no
Sorry,
worries.
I'm just trying
Uh,
to jump in here.
yeah, no worries. And apparently, there were some like much crazier things that went on too in the 4th of July. Like the partying was really wild. I heard one story. There was once, at least in Exeter, New Hampshire, this thing called the Parade of Horribles, where people would like dress up as hobos and try and see who can outnoise the other person.
That's really interesting. I did not read about that. That sounds really fun though.
It
Not for them,
does.
not for their neighbors.
Yeah, definitely not for their neighbors, but I'm curious, like if that was happening, about 45 minutes for me, and I'm gonna guess 25 minutes from you, like what other things were going on in this country during the 1800s?
Well, during the thing about America in the 1800s was people were it was a people were not so connected as they are now. And people did not travel quite the extent that we do now. And so different places really formed their own regionally specific um, traditions. Like the idea of like someone from Ohio and someone from New England and someone from California all hanging out and chatting about the same things would be almost impossible. Like they might understand vague, big broad concepts like a big election or a major war or something. But other than that, they really wouldn't have much to talk about because they didn't read the same types of newspapers. They didn't read the same. They didn't know the same kinds of people, and so that kind of low communication society is ripe for vibrant and wholly original and unique regional traditions like the one that you just described.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, going to different states or even different parts of states in the 1800s, you're telling me can be lesser or greater extent of someone going to like a completely different country.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, if you're someone from a city and you went to the country, not only did it take you hours and hours, if not days, to get to, say you were going to go on vacation, and you wanted to go to a cabin in the countryside with your family. So there's no cars, or there's very few cars. You're talking like the dawn of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Uh,
Depending on what part of the 1800s you're living in too.
right, the very, very, very end of the 1800s. Yeah, so if you're going to go on some sort of a trip with your family, uh, that entails getting a coach, and you got to have someone to help you with your bags. And if you're the kind of person to go on a trip like this, you're probably rich enough to have a servant or be able to hire a coach service and hire someone to help you with your stuff. You get to the train station, you put your stuff on the train, you go to wherever you're going, you disembark, you get all your stuff onto another wagon, and you trundle along for sometimes hours, you know, up roads, down roads, finally get to the place where you're going. And now you are truly, truly far removed from where you are. Now, the kinds of people that you run into don't have the same kind of, if you're out in the countryside, you're probably a farmer. And if you're a farmer, you don't have the same access to education as in the city, same access to opportunities. So you're probably you're probably not making quite as much money. Uh, and at the time, there were magazines, newspapers, but they didn't have the same kind of grand circulation. It's not like everybody read the New York Times, everybody read the Washington Post. The New York Times was for people in New York, and the Washington Post, something like the Washington Post is for people who live in Washington. And if these people are reading about current events, they're reading about current events in their own town. So when you as a city person meet this person, you're meeting someone who has totally different experience of life, someone who doesn't know about the things you know about, someone who is fairly isolated and spends almost their entire life just in this small rural community. You guys are not going to have a lot to talk about, and you're going to look at them as someone who is very alien, and they are going to look at you as someone who is fairly alien, even though you speak the same language and you're citizens of the same country. uh, the fact of how difficult and long transportation was meant that in general, populations who were distant from each other had very, very little in common.
Okay, that's a pretty clear visual on what life was like. Um, so yeah, I mean, if you could afford it, you traveled by horse. If you had money and the resources for it, you could travel by stage coach. Uh, and funny enough, there were some changes throughout the 1800s. We had trains come in big time, and huge improvements with creating steam engines and all of that. And in the 1800s, there were cars that only traveled up to 25 miles an hour, and that's how people got along. But that is very interesting, though, that all in part from the difficult travels. Um, the fact that although you and I probably live about 30, 40 minutes from each other, um, the duration or the distance between the two of us during that time period, if you and I were to have traveled and had either A, met in the middle, or B, one went to the other, we would be pretty foreign to each other.
It would have taken days. I mean, we live 40 minutes by car, but by horse, like we probably live over a day from each other. And if we wanted to hang out, that's a huge time commitment. That is, it's not going to be something that happens all the time. So even if we did see each other, it would be pretty infrequently. And I have a hard time going to get myself to drive an hour down to see my friend in Cambridge, in Cambridge, Mass. I can't imagine how little I would see people if I had to live back in the 1800s when seeing people took that much more effort and energy. But at the same time, it was something that people have always desperately wanted to do, and they would travel all the time to see people. They would have to stay for days to make the trip worthwhile, and then they would come back. But the fact that it took so long and so much effort and so much time and money and energy, because you got to stay places, you got to eat, you got to prepare for emergencies. Um, it means that it did not happen as frequently, and so you had much more isolated pockets of the world. Now that said, there were things in common, especially if, circling back to Independence Day, there were some things that were fairly common in terms of how people celebrated it, um, because of kind of a diffusion of from the original celebrations in Philadelphia when the Declaration of Independence was signed.
Okay. So the Declaration of Independence is signed. And was that like the primary thing? We would all celebrate. It's like, okay, we declared ourselves as an independent country. This is our breakup letter to England. Was
Well, it's sorry, what were we saying?
I was gonna say, was there more? I mean, was there more to this that was being celebrated?
Well, the big thing about it was that it was it was really the first national it was the first national holiday, because before then, there had been holidays, there had been, you know, Christmas and Thanksgiving and and then, the king's birthday. You would have these public celebrations, but none of them were distinctly national in character until, of course, we declared ourselves as our own country, and the colonies declared independence from the British Empire, and it was therefore something much more special and much more new. It was something that we had that no one else had, and it was something that came about because at the time, America was very, very unique. It was this democratic republic that split off from a major uh, imperial power. And of course, then our example paved the way for France and for South America and for many, for pretty much every other uh, democratic, liberal republic from then on. And we were very aware of how special that was. I actually have a quote. So I have this wonderful resource, this wonderful firsthand account. It's a book called 40 Years of American Life by Thomas Nichols. Thomas Nichols was a man who he was a traveler, he was a writer, and he was living in England at the time. And he grew up in America, and he wrote this book for a British audience describing what life was like from 1821 to 1861. So that, of course, is from very early part of the 20th of the 19th century all the way through the beginning of the Civil War. And this guy actually, interestingly, is from New Hampshire. He was born in Orford, New Hampshire, which is in Grafton County, all the way on the other side of the state towards on the border of Vermont. And he was born in 1815. So this was only a couple decades after the Declaration of Independence. And so when he was growing up basically in the first or second generation of Americans, as their own country. And what he describes, he actually has a whole whole chapter called "The Spirit of '76," where he talks about how his father was a part of the military during the War of 1812, and how many Americans actually were in the military and who joined the military, have military militia service, kind of like what we have nowadays, where we have a volunteer army, National Guard. You serve a couple, you know, you can serve a couple of years, and then it's like as long as there's no war on it, you kind of get out, basically just doing the training and climbing up the ranks, and then you get discharged and you go live a normal life. But what he talks about is the military. So this I'm beginning a quote here: "The military spirit and the spirit of patriotism in my early days were universal. We had no doubt that ours was the freest, most enlightened, and happiest country and in the world. And in spite of the envy of tyrants, we felt sure that all the rest of mankind would soon be of the same opinion and only too glad to follow our examples. We entertained these sentiments at all times, but devoted one day in the year, in an especial manner, to their expression. This was the 4th of July." So this he talks about, and the interesting thing is, so he talks about this, his description of celebrating 4th of July and the mood and the spirit of the day match what I've read about what was happening in other parts of America at the time, and I think that's what I find really interesting. um, so there was this, so you can tell from that quote that there was this sense of being special, and of course, the 4th of July was the ultimate expression of the genesis of this kind of special race of mankind, this special nation.
Yeah, very unique. Very, very like it's interesting to look back on somebody's writings to talk about, to be bragging about how unique they found their own country in comparison to the rest of the world.
Well, in every country too, obviously every country has their own culture, but America was, the newest country. And there's another quote from later in the chapter that I love as well. Um, America, being in her childhood, was more prone to look forward to the future than back upon the past. She had but little in the past to look back upon, and the less she had of memory, the more her sanguine orators indulged in hope. The history of the future was as glorious as we chose to make it. So I think that sentiment also is part of this sense that we have so much to look forward to. We are so young and we have so much promise because look at what we've done. We've fought a war of independence. We created our own country. We established our own laws, and we're living life. This is in the broad sense. We're living life as we choose to. Uh, and I think that self-determination that we associate now very much with the American spirit, individualism and taking charge of your future and all that kind of stuff. Um, has been around probably since the earliest colonial days. Everybody having to kind of stake their claim and make their patch of land work. But it developed into part of the national character, I think, by this time as well.
Yeah, yeah, you definitely see that bit of bragging rights, like, oh yes, here we are, we're the new country, we're gonna do this. It's gonna be us. We're awesome.
Yeah, and no one's telling us what to do. We're not subject to some other country. We do things our own way, and
Yeah.
this holiday is something we have to celebrate that.
Okay. So we have a holiday where we get to kind of take kind of take a moment to brag and think about how we have this, or at least in the writings of one guy that lived in New Hampshire, this cultural identity built around how we get to choose our future. We get to take our fate into our own hands.
And it was immense pride as well, because one thing you also read when you read about the celebrations of the Fourth of July in the 19th century is that they generally involved the actual reading of uh, these early political documents. We actually there someone would read the Declaration of Independence out loud, uh, and then there would be some oration. There would be some speech given by prominent people and a prominent person in the town, or local mayor, or a general, or a preacher. But reading the Declaration of Independence was always a big part of the Fourth of July. It was, almost almost like kind of a sacred reading. It's because it's very solemn. It's because, and that's one thing that I think it would be interesting if we had that still, because of course we all know what the Declaration of Independence is, and most of us can quote a couple sentences from it, but Fourth of July just being kind of a day to, you know, ironically or not, be super, America rocks, and drinking beer and barbecuing and getting drunk and sloppy and stuff, is fun. It's fun, but I think it would be interesting to reintroduce that historical part, that original part of it, that, so that we really truly understand what the day means. And whatever someone's criticisms of America, American culture, American history, American society, and of all of the dark things that have happened since 1776 or 1777, that it is special and unique and interesting, and should be reflected on.
Yeah, and definitely, I would agree with that. To talk about the Declaration of Independence and talk about our country's history, and maybe get back into that roots of we're young, we can own this, we can choose where we're gonna go. Um, because it seems very optimistic as well, where this author's going. He's very like hopeful about having a future ahead instead of a long past behind. There is no lengthy history to us right now, and so that means we get to go ahead and make our own history. Um, so what were other things being done aside from reading the Constitution, or not necessarily the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and celebrating that document?
Well, fireworks definitely were a thing. Fireworks from I believe the first reading of the Declaration of Independence, like mere days after it had been signed. Uh, Fireworks were a part of the celebration. They weren't they weren't exactly the big crazy displays that we have now. Obviously, we have technology. We've been building on that technology for a couple centuries, but
Yeah,
they would still, they were a little. There would be pops and bursts and like sprinklers or sorry, am I
sparklers.
sparklers? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sparklers. That kind of thing. But still, very fun to watch, visually stimulating, and especially if you were uh, like most people back then, a rural kind of agricultural person. It's nice to get together in a big party and have a giant picnic and um, and see some fireworks go off. There was also always a 13 gun salute. So the members of the local militia uh, would get together and they would fire off a 13 gun salute, one for each of the original colonies. That was usually a thing as well.
Well, that's unique.
Yeah.
Do we have any? Would it just? Do you have anything on what would be done with that? Like, would they just get out and each fire around, or would somebody say something, or would there be a speech given before the 13 gun salute?
Well, allow me to read because I happen to have a quote right here. After the reading came the reading of the Declaration of Independence, came the oration. It was given by an intelligent farmer, a militia colonel, and deputy sheriff. It recounted the labors, sacrifices, and perils of the past, the freedom and prosperity of the present, and the glories of the coming future. After the oration came another national salute, 13 guns, one for each of the original states, from the 56, that's a 56 pound, 56-pound weight, like cannon. Um, a feu de joie from the old flintlock muskets of the militia, so just like shooting up into the air, hooting and hollering. And then an attack upon the bread and cheese and rum punch provided by the committee, so a local committee that set up the whole day of festivities. I sat upon the breezy brow of the hill, in the shade of the singing pine trees, looking down upon the beautiful valley of my world, thinking of all I had heard of our glorious country and its great destiny, and wondering what share I, a boy then 8 or 9 years old, was to have in its future. But there was one more thing that he references that also makes a lot. It changes the character of the 4th of July in those days, which was that there were still into the early decades of the 19th century, there were still living veterans of the Revolutionary War, which changes everything. We obviously we know, muskets and, tri-cornered hats and stuff, but for a lot of people living in America at the time, they down the street was a guy who was like, in his 70s or 80s, and he fought. He was at Yorktown. He was at whatever battle from back then, you know. He knew George Washington. It was in living memory. And he was there, he was alive when the Declaration of Independence was signed, and he was probably one of the first people to hear it read aloud. It meant so much because the people who experienced it in real life, first person, were still there, and you could talk to them about it. And that, I think, makes a much bigger impression on.
They probably had some of those people part of their part of those ceremonies, part of the
Oh,
reading.
absolutely. Oh, yeah, they would want to involve them. They would call them up to give a little talk. Um, and they were treated with immense respect, because how else, in these days when our military, serves a number of functions, from a peacekeeping force to whatever, there's a lot of politics around the United States military and how it's used nowadays. uh but back in those days, they literally were the ones who fought the British and literally fought for our freedoms as a country. We haven't had to do that for centuries now. And so, obviously people, there's a lot of troop respect of our troops nowadays, but back then you're talking about people who literally faced down the redcoats, and if they hadn't fought, then we would not become an independent nation.
Yeah. So it was a much bigger deal at that time to be still having the living memory and the people who could recite what had happened, their perspective of what happened, fighting extraordinarily unfair odds and still managed to beat past uh, possibly like the superpower or one of the superpowers of the globe at the time.
Absolutely. And that too, I think, affects the optimism, because as a country we had not like, we as a country started off with a grand victory. We beat the British Empire and we established our own nation. And then, of course, through the Articles of Confederation and, various, the Whiskey Rebellion, like it's not like everything was all sunshine and rainbows for us early on, but we hadn't faced a major defeat yet. We won we won the War of Independence. We won the War of 1812. We had not suffered any major defeats, and we were opening up new parts of the country, the Louisiana Purchase, and then and then we defeated Mexico in the Mexican War, and then that opened up all the rest of, New Mexico and Arizona, Nevada, California, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. We were just on this constant march of some could call it conquest, but we were constantly expanding, and we were constantly gaining and growing, and there really was no reason to be depressed about the country's future. There was no reason to be anything but hopeful about the future, because we had had so much success as a country, as a society. Um, then, of course, the Civil War came, and that was a, that's a
That's
totally
a
different.
whole different ordeal, but
That's the whole different deal. And actually, the interesting thing about this book is that it's framed. He frames a lot of this perspective of what life was like back then as, but nowadays everything is, worse. When he talks about how things were when he was a kid, he's talking about, oh well, typical, I walked a mile a school, a mile each way to school when I was 4 years old, and we had to make our own clothes, and we had to, everything. And nowadays, the kids just get everything handed to them, and everything is so easy for them. They have no idea what it's like to, live a real life in the country, like, how it should be. Now they got jobs in the cities, and the girls are uh, the girls are wearing brand new dresses every month, and they're working at the mill, at the textile mills, instead of being at home knitting and making homespun cloths. Uh, so of course, so his account of childhood in the 1820s is very, it's there's we all look back at our childhoods with fondness and with this idea that it was this kind of golden time. When I was a kid in the 1990s, I look at it the same way, even though I'm very aware now that there was a lot more going on in the world back then, and that it wasn't, a perfect decade, a perfect time. So we do have to keep that in mind when we are reading firsthand accounts, is the bias and the psychology of the narrator of it.
Yeah, yeah. It also, I mean, it's got extraordinary bias against people living a more urbanized life. It's like you kids don't know. You guys need to get off my lawn. You need to go work hard life and
you
stop unendingly. It's like
you
so
kids that don't know
Puritan
what you
perspective.
kids don't know what hard work is until you've, built a barn from scratch after hewing down the timber yourself.
Gotta cut down the timber. You gotta fight off the animals. You gotta grow your own food, and you gotta
Exactly.
build your own house. So
That's right.
yeah, so there's that kind of bias he has against some of the innovations and changes going on at that time period. Um, which ironically, if you textile mills was its own hell.
Right, right.
So so yeah, that is unique to be seeing that type of perspective. It doesn't come too surprising because repetitively in our history here in America is people have always had a problem with any sort of exodus of people going from one area of the country to another. Um, and without getting into, without opening up that can of worms or diving deep into Pandora's box. So, is there other comments or mentions of other ceremonies or things related to the 4th of July preparations people might have made, outfits people could have worn? Were there certain foods people only had on the 4th of July or were particularly favored?
Well, one thing I can say is that the modern barbecue was not a thing yet. Um, the modern barbecue, of course, stems from African American traditions from, back when they were enslaved in the American South, and that tradition of making food did not spread culturally until long after. But at the time, of course, there were other types of foods instead. From this one source I have, they probably would have roasted a pig, in a kind of a traditional spit fashion, or if they lived near the coast, they might have done a seafood boil. Um, the the thing with foods back then was, especially because most of the country was at the time very rural, and not everything was available at all times, and you couldn't and uh, times were not always scarce, but you had to make do with what you had. And so I think, especially early on, the idea of having a special type of food for the 4th of July. I'm personally not aware of any of that. It was probably mostly, hey, let's have a big feast, let's have a party, let's have a picnic. You have that other guy referring to, attacking bread and cheese and rum punch. Some other people might have just, roasted pigs, or had a clam bake. Just any kind of big food that can serve large amounts of people, because this was a true festivity. This was a chance for people who otherwise kind of stayed on the farm to all come together and you know take the wagon down to town or out to the field where everybody else was meeting up, and they get to see their friends. They get to uh, share food and stories, and hang out with each other, drink with each other. So it would have been anything really that could feed a large amount of people.
Okay. I mean, it sounds kind of very much just like a good old feast day, except the occasion that we're celebrating is America's birthday.
Exactly, because these holidays didn't happen all the time, and you honestly, farm life is very tedious and very monotonous. And what better way to get away from the tediousness, the tedium, and the monotony uh, than to leave the farm and go off somewhere, and even if it's just to have bread and cheese and rum punch with some neighbors that you haven't seen for a little while, like that's going to be good enough. And then you get to see some guys shooting off guns, and someone's going to read the Declaration of Independence, and you get to feel what it is to be uniquely an American. And then they're going to shoot off fireworks and a cannon. That sounds like a great time. I love it. Probably
Yeah.
play some probably play some fifes. Probably have a parade. They would also do parades at the time. They were a little bit different than what we have now. Now, if we're talking more in city life, uh, town life, they would have parades, but parades were not. It wouldn't be like the Shriners, and then the cop car, and then the preschool, or like the kindergarten, school marching band, whatever thing. You wouldn't have that. Instead, what you would do is you'd have a parade of different groups of people. So like all the shipwrights would march in a group, all the firemen would march in a group, all of the cobblers would march in a group. They would get together. Sometimes they would build floats. Where this is getting further on into the 19th century. This is as things are growing, and the country is swelling in population, um,
And they built some mighty floats during that time period.
yeah, especially if you were a shipwright, if you were a woodworker, then yeah, you could probably build some pretty crazy things.
Yeah. Yeah. So these were huge at that time. Um, Now, this would have been one of the few holidays Americans would have had to have celebrated throughout the year, or would there have been more at this time where people would have gone together
Well,
to do these
there
things?
wouldn't have. This was certainly the biggest national holiday. There were other occasions that people found to, take. There were religious days, like Easter and Christmas. But in terms of truly American holidays, political holidays, this was one of the only ones that we really had, because a lot of the national holidays we have now have accumulated over the years, but weren't all there early on. Um, Obviously we wouldn't have had Martin Luther King Day or something like that, or armed forces or Veterans Day didn't start until I think the late 19th century, early 20th century.
Mhm.
Um, and even the 4th of July was not a official holiday until I think 1870. So for most of the 19th century, most from 1776 to 1870, it was an it was kind of an informal holiday. It was not, a day that people officially got off.
Hmm.
And actually, and it was originally an unpaid federal holiday, and it was only a long time after that it was made into a paid holiday. But
Wow. Okay, that is that is unique. Started off as unpaid and eventually it became paid, and yeah, it took a while. As beforehand, it was just kind of more of like, oh, we know that this was when the Declaration was signed, so let's celebrate it. And then, but that is kind of unique. But that's cool though to see that people back then took that kind of pride within their country to still go ahead and do it, regardless that it may have not really even been an official federal holiday.
right, and I'm not sure of the politics that went into. I'm not sure if anybody had proposed, hey, we should make this a day that everybody gets off. That's something that I would have to read a little bit more about. But I mean, this was also a time when people didn't, there was no such thing as a weekend.
Yep.
Uh, there was no, labor, work was very different. You didn't work on Sunday, but most people worked, all day, every day, except for, when they're going to church. So the idea of having extra days off. I mean, think about it too. When you got a majority agricultural society, uh, there it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to have these things like weekends, because when you live on a farm, every day is a day you got to work. Like you can't like the cows still need to be milked, and the horses still need to be fed, and the whatever needs to be done. Like you can't put that stuff off. It's not until really the second industrial revolution, which was also the 19th century, uh, when more and more and more people started to have either manufacturing jobs or white collar city jobs, being secretaries or um, doing various things that involve keeping and maintaining records of large amounts of merchandise and all that. That you get this idea of, okay, well, I'm going to clock in and I'm going to clock out. This is when I work. This is when I don't work. And over time, people grew to demand regulations and working hours, so that they're not just working 20 hours a day, and having a weekend and having national holidays and days off. So it doesn't surprise me that it took so long for it to be recognized as a official federal holiday.
Yeah, yeah, that definitely paints a good picture as to why. Um, Now it is interesting too to also recognize, even when it was not an official federal holiday, that there still was this sense of pride that people had um, in their country, and the willingness that people wanted to take the time to take the time to just go celebrate it, and remember those that were in the Revolutionary War. Um, Now, during our first holiday interview, when we got into 1800s Christmas, um, you mentioned before how there was like a really big fad, and it was encouraged by the US government to try and get a predominantly immigrant population to now try and have something in common with their neighbors. Do you see any accounts or documents when this is something along this lines was happening on the 4th of July, where these foreign neighbors would be wanting to explicitly celebrate together?
Well, especially in a big city, where you've got these big parades happening. it naturally would have drawn, it would have drawn the attention of these people from, these immigrant classes. They certainly weren't. I haven't read any about them being, excluded or or exhorted to join in. I think that would have been just more on an individual basis. When you came from a foreign country and you didn't speak the language, you naturally would associate with people from your your country. There would be like Little Italy or Chinatown or the Irish section, Irish Quarter. Um, but but the Fourth of July is a national holiday, as um, would have invited people from all over from different persuasions and different backgrounds to celebrate as a citizen, provided you were a citizen. And that actually would be some interesting research to conduct, is if there were unique, kind of maybe smaller, for those that had not integrated into society as much, would they have celebrated maybe in their own way? I do know that I do remember reading instances, back when we were talking about the gold rush in California. There were lots of Chileans in California that came up to mine gold, and they would celebrate their own Independence Day in California, of Chile, of their own Independence Day. Um, and people watching would just, good for them. Um, my take on it would be that it's a holiday for kind of anyone to celebrate, anyone to get involved with. And if you've got good relations with your neighbors, I don't think, they'd probably slap you on the shoulder and hand you a mug of rum punch and invite you to celebrate right along with
Right on, right on. Is there anything else you would like to share?
them. Not too much. Just I think it's to sum up. Fourth of July has always been extremely important in America. It has always been celebrated by drinking and feasting and fireworks. It used to have more of a little bit more of a historical, cultural, political focus with reading the Declaration of Independence and talking about the importance of what all that brought America to be as an independent nation. And I don't think people have forgotten it. I mean, I don't think anybody can. Everybody knows what the Fourth of July is about. Everybody is aware of the American Revolution, and I don't think anybody's forgetting any of that stuff. Um, but I think it'd be cool to have people read the Declaration of Independence, so we can really meditate on those words, and maybe in today's charged political climate, people of all different political persuasions hearing those words regularly might help us to all maybe find some more common ground.
Yeah, I would agree.
Something hopeful for the future, which of course is very American.
Very American. Always looking for the future. Okay, Philip, do you have any messages for future generations?
Just don't forget history. Read about history.
I'd agree with you on that one. Thank you again.
You're welcome.